Hello folks, today we're going to be talking about Hyperspace Hunter Aylamak and where I think he's going to fit into the Idle Heroes meta coming up. I'll probably reinforce a lot of the things you've already heard already from other content creators, as well as giving you my own thoughts and opinions on how good this hero is going to be. We're going to be answering questions such as, will he be good in the early game, in the mid game, in the late game, where I think you should fit him into your team, and how you should think about him as a hero when asking the question, is he going to be good for my account? So if we take a look here, first of all, you'll notice he's pretty standard. He's a warrior, which we've seen a lot of, so instantly that's a red flag because a lot of the biggest heroes in the game right now are Asmodel, Mockman, Vulcan, warriors that are commonly banned in Force Wars. So I see that as a bit of an issue for this guy. So if any of you were getting your hopes up for building Hyperspace Hunter Aylamak in Force War, you might find he gets banned, and that's a little bit of a pain. However, Force War is but one game mode, and a game mode many people don't really care about, so that's just one side thought to think about. Realistically, he's more of a support hero that's going to help you in many areas of the game. Now, the thing I want to draw your attention to first is this here. It's called Splendid Block. When an ally blocks successfully, he will grant that ally a shield equal to 860% of his attack and grant them Elegance for 2 rounds. Elegance is a skill effect. It increases the all damage reduction that your hero has by 15%. That's fantastic, so that's going to add with Freya's all damage reduction she gives to a team, and also Halora's all damage reduction she gives on her final passive when she has been sublimed. So already we have synergies here where we have more and more heroes granting all damage reduction to your heroes. We also have star spawns that give all damage reduction. There's Golden Crown, but then you could even argue, is Golden Crown too much? So that then raises the question, maybe a Splendid Gilded Purple Fan is the artifact to go for on your teammates to give them protection when on the same team as him. Potential sustain style teams you could think about there. Whether that's the best option, we'll talk about that a little later on. Either way, this is a fantastic ability as it's giving you healing, it's giving you damage reduction, and also when the Elegance ends, which is after those 2 rounds, you then gain 15% all damage reduction if you go ahead and improve this to Noble on the sublimation tree. So that's fantastic as well, so it continues across. He also has the ability to increase an ally's holy damage by 5% until the battle ends. So this is an endless buff. It can only be triggered once, though, by the same hero each round. So that's a guaranteed 5% holy damage. That really screams out as a really solid buff for things like Star Expedition. A continuous 5% holy damage is fantastic, and that's if your hero blocks, which hopefully you can do. So people have already suggested going into this week with Star Expedition, he could be a good support or even main hero for Star Expedition. We'll be talking a lot about that, although really testing this week, as it is Star Expedition week right now, will have to come into play to discover whether he is truly a hero worth investing in. Now, that's the first thing you need to think about here, is he's granting fantastic shields when your team blocks, and that alone makes him a really reliable way to generate shields. The only alternative hero we've had to that has been Fairy Queen Vesa, whose active skill grants shields to the entire team, which is phenomenal, and also heals your team as well. So a lot of people have suggested that Hyperspace Hunter Aylamak is actually a good replacement for Fairy Queen Vesa, because you could argue if you're getting shields from one of these heroes, whether it's Vesa or Aylamak, the other one is kind of redundant, assuming those shields will hold up, and that's a fair argument to make. The key thing that sets those 2 heroes apart, though, is Vesa needs her active skill, whereas Hyperspace Hunter Aylamak is reactive. So you really need to consider the kind of opponents you're facing as to which of these abilities you want to lean on. If, for example, you are playing against opponents where you are faster than them, Fairy Queen Vesa's active skill is going to be incredibly reliable, because you can kind of ensure that those shields are going to go up by using an energy artifact nice and early, giving your team that much needed protection. On the other hand, if you aren't guaranteed to be faster than the opponent, let's say you're doing deep levels of Void campaign where the opponents are really quick, then actually Hyperspace Hunter Aylamak's abilities will be really reliable, because you will get hit by those opponents first, and then your shields will come up on your allies, giving you more chance of living through that first barrage of attacks. And that is often something a lot of people struggle with. When opponents are quicker than you, there are 2 things you need to worry about. Burst, which is getting straight up killed, so this will give us shields to protect us from that. And secondly, it's crowd control. And if you look at the last Transcendence hero we gained, which is Elena, she is granting us protection against crowd control with her passive here. When an enemy releases an active skill, we can reduce their speed and remove a random control effect from one ally. And of course, by subliming that, you can make that even more consistent by removing one additional random control effect by one ally. So by using Aylamak alongside Elena, on a team that's reactive and slower than the opponents, you can guarantee that you're going to have protection against crowd control thanks to Elena's passive, and also survivability granted by those shields and that damage reduction given by Aylamak. That also makes me want to draw your attention to Mystic Fairy Freya. If you've ever used a Freya, you'll know that getting her active skill off early is fantastic because that grants one layer of evolutionary factor, and that first layer increases all allies' damage reduction by 30%, which you really do feel once that active skill has been triggered. And that allows actually a lot of lower level heroes who don't have Tree of Origin improvements to survive when combined with something like a Golden Crown. If you go and look at a hero like Aylamak, he is giving us that protection passively. So just like an alternative to Fairy Queen versus Shields, this Elegance is an alternative to Mystic Fairy Freya's damage reduction. So potentially something really worth considering here. A lot of the impressions you should be getting from this is that Aylamak is a support hero, but he falls into one very strong weak spot as a support hero, which is that the shields he grants you are scaling with his attack. For those shields to be impactful, you need to make him a homeowner. However, given the fact that we're wanting to use him as a support hero to protect the team, it seems weird to make him your primary homeowner, because typically the meta is at a point where burst is the way forwards. So let's look at his active skill to see if that's granting us burst. Well, if you look here, it attacks enemies 6 times, dealing 800% of attack damage to one enemy at random each time. So this is very similar to Fairy Queen Vesa's random attack that goes out. Now, granted, this is fantastic when there's a low number of opponents, because that damage will get focused on either one or two of those opponents, because the lower number means the randomness isn't going to play a factor. However, if instead you're facing a team of, let's say, 6 opponents, instantly this becomes a lot weaker because it's randomly hitting opponents. You can't really guarantee that you're gonna get a good amount of damage off, and it's hitting randomly anyone, so you can't really ensure that it's going to be consistent. So that's bad. If you compare that with someone like Mockman or Vulcan, or let's say Asmodel the Dauntless if you've got him as a giant killer, these active skills are huge. They hit all opponents, have tons of ways of hitting enemies, and loads of different compounding forms of damage, which then scale with skill damage that then of course cause a massive amount of damage to throw down on your opponent. This is brilliant, and this bursty way of dealing with attacks is why we see so many people using Mockman, Vulcan, Asmodel, even Sword Flash as a homeowner. So if you wanted to use an Aylamak as a homeowner to ensure that his shields were good, you're not going to get that really good bursty damage. Therefore, anyone that's smart enough at this point to see the link I'm going to make, it's that you want him to be a secondary homeowner. So this is a hero you want to build when you have 2 Celestial Island homes, one that is already maxed for your main damage dealer, and then you're working on a second home for him to sit in. That has already proven fantastic in PvP and Void Campaign due to the protection he gives, and also due to the disruption you get actually as well, because you're not just gaining shields and healing and elegance from all of this, you're actually getting yourself something real spicy here. Whenever he blocks successfully, he's going to counterattack, and there's a 65% chance that he stuns the attacker for 2 rounds. So that's disruptive stun. Now, against an opponent who, let's say, has control purify, stunning them might not seem amazing because they've already attacked and they're going to remove that stun at the end of the round. However, if you're able to put multiple control effects on opponents, whether you run him alongside a Jara or a Lord of Fear Aspen, you can actually lock down opponents pretty consistently, because multiple control effects, they can only really remove one, or at least if it's PvP. That said, though, that stun can also be totally removed by someone like Elena, so don't guarantee it's going to be good. It could potentially be successful, though, so more control is always nice. And that actually draws me to his core now, because stun isn't the only control that Aylamak is capable of. He's able to taunt. At the beginning of each round, he reduces all enemies' precision, so that's great. That means anything that your opponent can add to make you not block as well, because precision counteracts block, and as you've already seen, we need our team to block to gain those shields. Also, there's a 100% chance to taunt 2 enemies with the highest attack for 2 rounds, so that means those attacks are guaranteed to hit Hyperspace Hunter Aylamak, and that then means if he blocks, he's going to hit them with that chance to stun, so that's quite nice. Also, the fact that they're taunted means what would be a huge amount of burst damage, which typically a lot of opponents are doing in PvP, right? Instead, that's all going to get focused on Aylamak. So imagine you've got a Vulcan ready to do a huge active skill and everything goes into Aylamak. That's going to keep your team alive against that opposing Vulcan. So we see now there's a meta shift in player versus player, where people were originally using Star Alchemist Holmes Young with Star Alchemist Holmes Young's core because the disruption that you can gain from perceptual disorder is fantastic when a teammate dies, and that's reactive. Again, that's something that happens regardless of you doing something. It's just an ally needs to die, so you don't have to attack. Well, your boy over here, Mr. Aylamak, is actually going to go ahead and taunt the two enemies with the highest attack at the beginning of each battle. So that's fantastic. They get taunted right from the start. That's better than reactive. That's guaranteed. So really horrid effect, because that means it's already triggered. And we haven't really seen anything like this before in the game. Like, if you look at abilities that have always been significantly powerful, it's heroes like Rogan that just give an effect to your team. It's like, here you go, here's a bunch of speed. Well, this guy's saying, if you give him the call, here you go, opponents, the two highest attack you have just got taunted. Brutal effect, absolutely brutal in player versus player. So anyone that's like an end game whale looking for something to invest in, perhaps getting his core with Hyperspace Hunter Aylamak could be something to aim towards in the future. Now, I know this core is going to be difficult as you have to obtain it this event, but there will be future opportunities to gain the core, so potentially we will see this slowly creeping into the PvP meta. Now, the reason I'm making this video now is so that people don't just suddenly jump on this for Ace, which is going to give our guild, or any guild that already figured this one out, a good edge in Ace Championships. So good luck to those folks that already knew this was a thing. Also, for every 6 successful blocks, there's a 60% chance to taunt 2 enemies with the highest attack for 2 rounds. So every time there's going to be blocks, so that's after the beginning of each battle. If he blocks 6 times, there's a chance to taunt enemies. That's less important. The main thing is that early taunt that comes up. Also, he's going to reduce their crit by 50%, their holy damage by 15% for 3 rounds, and reduces all enemies' precision by 30%. So that might sound all like redundant stuff at the end because you need to block 6 times, and potentially you could argue it is, but it might come into play. The big thing, though, is, of course, that precision debuff, and most importantly, that 100% chance to taunt 2 enemies. So we like this. This is a big thumbs up from me. That core is nice. So you're probably wondering, when would I build a Hyperspace Hunter Aylamak on my account? Well, for early game players, I think you could potentially consider building him right at the start. He is potentially a support hero that will work instead of Fairy Queen Vesa, and any guide that has ever encouraged you to build a Fairy Queen Vesa, I think you could substitute Hyperspace Hunter Aylamak in quite nicely, considering that he has these counterattacks which are able to deal damage and burn the opponents, as well as these random patchy damages that he's able to do. He could potentially compete with Vesa in boss fights. One key thing about Vesa, though, is she will continuously increase the number of attacks she does up to 12 times, so rather than 6 times like Aylamak, and that's pretty locked in, she will be doing 12 times. However, he gains better bonuses from skill damage improvements, as there are multiple components to his attacks, more so than Vesa, so you are likely to see huge increases in damage there from him, plus that 5% damage bonus he gives to holy damage here on that passive effect could actually add up quite nicely, as that's similar to continuous bonuses we gain from Antler's Cane or Mystic Fairy Freya's evolutionary factor. On top of that, because his abilities are reactive and you're going to gain the shields when you block, you might find that that works actually quite nicely with a hero like Eloise. That said, though, in the early game it's very easy to get shields off with a Fairy Queen Vesa because enemies aren't going to outspeed you, so using an energy artifact on Vesa is still a very reliable way to gain shields. Hopefully you can see from that analysis that both Aylamak and Vesa are both excellent, and you could use either successfully. The only question is, will Aylamak conflict with Eloise, as he does of course stun opponents when he blocks. So if you're using Eloise, one of the best early game heroes ever, and relying on that block, which you absolutely should do to counterattack opponents, you might find that his stun is a little counter synergistic. So I would personally still go with Fairy Queen Vesa as a support alongside Eloise, but you could easily put in Aylamak and have a little experiment if you wanted, because it's still encouraged that when you get to 2 Transcendence heroes, you have a Burst hero and Lord of Fear Aspen, because it is still the best thing you could possibly have on an account with 2 Transcendence heroes. It's a Lord of Fear Aspen with a Ruyi Scepter to give that fear off to your opposing team, because that's fantastic. That backline Fear Abyssal Gaze is amazing. And on top of that, if you're going ahead and looking for a burst hero that can capitalize on that, that's much better than going with someone like Aylamak. So Sword Flash comes to mind, so does Mockman, as early burst heroes you can use reliably. In fact, people have even been seeing success using Asmodel the Dauntless alongside a Lord of Fear Aspen as an early hero opportunity, since of course Asmo has been increasing in popularity as he has been featured more and more in live content. That said though, if you were to use an Asmodel the Dauntless, it's pretty much experimental territory, although it follows the same principles of using a Melodic Strings damage dealer alongside a Ruyi Scepter Lord of Fear Aspen. So by that point you can probably assume that Aylamak's not going to come into play there, and you'd be correct. 2 Transcendence heroes, there is no room for him. So can he come in at Transcendence number 3? Well, maybe. If you're not relying on getting in a Tenant, so let's say you went Mockman, Lord of Fear Aspen, a common next choice would be Starwing Jara because she actually fills a Tenant slot for Mockman. I would then still go with the Starwing Jara. However, when you then maybe consider going for Star Alchemist Homeowner with his core, it could absolutely be argued that a better choice would be Aylamak and his core, and that's actually a more reliable, better hero and a hero that you can actually enjoy using the core on, because the problem with Star Alchemist Homeowner is he's never really been a good addition to a team outside of using his core, whereas actually Aylamak is granting you way better bonuses. He's giving you shields, he's giving you healing, he's giving you protection, he's giving you damage buffs, but he's also got a really nice disruptive core. So I think maybe a 3 Transcendence heroes or 4 Transcendence heroes, if you can get the core for him, you should then consider slotting him into your team. I think we might see people going Lord of Fear Aspen with Sword Flash and Aylamak. That could be a common trio. You might see that do quite well in Void Campaign as well. Also, that kind of substitutes from people who would normally go for Fairy Queen Vesa as a 3rd Transcendence hero with a Sword Flash, so that's potentially an opportunity for him to come in. However, I think the most common time that people will choose to build him, like I alluded to earlier on in the video, is when you have a full Celestial Island all ready for one hero, so that you can begin investing in a 2nd Celestial Island house for him. If in the Cloud Island you're a bit like me and can go ahead and look at 2 lovely jubbly houses, you'll see I've got a really nice one built up for Eos, and I've got a really nice one built up for Asmodel. Both of these heroes are benefiting from a huge number of stats, and that's when Aylamak really shines, because not only do you get the benefit of using him, using his core to get the taunt on opponents, you also absolutely get the benefit of going ahead and gaining all those shields. And those shields will combo brilliantly with Gilded Purple Fan to give you some much needed protection. Now, there are a few teams that are emerging currently in the meta based on the release of this hero. First, you'll be seeing teams that are using Aylamak to protect bursting lineups. These are lineups that will use heroes like Sword Flash or Mockman to deal damage quickly to the opponent to break them down. Typically, these teams have been weak to heroes like Vulcan, because Vulcan comes in, stays alive, tanks, and then absolutely pounds them after he's gained tons of rays and explosions and piercing shots and all the crazy charged skills he has, which he then releases in an active and annihilates the whole enemy team. That's a terrifying team to fight, but thankfully, due to the taunt and the disruption that Aylamak has, along with the stun and the shields, he's able to give your team survivability, which means potentially your burst will pay. That's good, and you could potentially cut down the opponent before your squishy burst team is defeated. We like that. On top of that, there's also going to be teams that are using him to disrupt early burst teams. Because of that taunt, it suddenly gets focused into the Aylamak to protect you against that, and then you can clean up with the rest of your team. So he has a way of slotting into both styles of lineups. Also, for things like Void Campaign, Void Vortex, Realms Gate, if you're facing opponents that are quicker than you, you will appreciate an Aylamak because he has very consistent reactive abilities, which potentially will trigger much sooner than you would with a Freya or with a Vesa. And that means you're getting that protection, like we said. So they're the types of teams you'll be seeing him used on. And actually some fun heroes that have been spiking up recently is for bursty teams. People have started using Drake now, which is really good. He's making a resurgence in PvP. And on sustain style lineups, especially in iOS, we're seeing people using Waldeck because of his Blood Frenzy ability, giving the ability to heal and also buff the team's damage. That's potentially working quite nicely with sustain style Vulcan teams, allowing that Vulcan to pop off even more thanks to all the buffs from Blood Frenzy. So if you're a late game PvP player or someone just enjoys dabbling, potentially there's two heroes to consider, depending on what kind of meta strategy you go for. We've also seen people just running a ton of Gilded Purple fans on their teams. That's not necessarily the best thing to do, but if you've got enough stats, you might as well get away with it with this new hero, because he is, of course, giving you a ton of ways of shutting down your opponent, and also giving you shields too, which is very, very nice. Now, one huge issue for Aylamak is if you wanted to make him a secondary homeowner, you have to build his tenants. That's how it goes for any homeowner. But unfortunately, his tenants are terrible. He's got himself and Saja. So Saja is an assassin, gives terrible scaling, don't want to consider her. So we go with Aylamak as our choice. And tenant spot 2 is Star Alchemist, Homeowner, and Vulcan. Well, we always want to go with the Transcendence hero, so we'd rather build the Star Alchemist, Homeowner here. But the problem with Star Alchemist, Homeowner is he is not a very good hero, because we want Star Alchemist Homeowner's core for him to be basically useful on our team, but we also want Aylamak's core to guarantee that early taunt. So unless you're really, really hard set on using Star Alchemist Homeowner with a core and Aylamak on that same team regardless, it's going to be really hard to justify building a Star Alchemist Homeowner and an Aylamak on the same account. Moving across to tenant spot 3, we've got Fiona. She's a priest, and she's the only one you can choose here, which is annoying. Priests don't give as much as a warrior, mage, or ranger would, so the stat scaling there is not going to be great. And of course, you're sat there kind of waiting for the release of a new hero. That could be annoying. And then tenant spot 4 is a Sword Flash. Sword Flash, despite giving a decent amount of stats, is not actually a hero you want to be building, because she's only good as a homeowner to be a damage dealer. If you're building her as a tenant, it means you have multiple Transcendence heroes going spare that, of course, aren't going to be used on your team, so you can get away with building her. That's great if you have 7, 8, or 9 Transcendence heroes, but for the average player who's just trying to put something together for this second home, they're really going to be kind of kicked in the gonads if they're trying to force out a Sword Flash early on, unless, of course, that Sword Flash is their main homeowner. But then if they're the main homeowner, they're not even going to be in tenant spot 4, because they're going to be off in their main home. So it's not going to work. So you're kind of forced to go with basic heroes here to really get the most out of Aylamak, and we need to see the release of new Transcendence heroes to actually hopefully play their role as support heroes that can just be tenants. And if you go ahead and look at Fairy Queen Vesa, that in my opinion is the biggest argument to build Fairy Queen Vesa as a secondary homeowner for earlier players that have, maybe, I say earlier, people that have got like 6 or 7 Transcendence heroes as opposed to 8, 9, or 10. The reason that's the case is Mystic Fairy Freya is just a good hero that you want on pretty much any account that's got to that point, so absolutely don't mind putting her in tenant spot 2. And Jara is just reliable, and she's great to have on an account, so Jara here in tenant spot 4 is lovely. Vesa just has nice tenants. Aylamak, on the other hand, has conflicting tenants, or tenants that you really don't want to build, so we find ourselves absolutely stuck. So really, an Aylamak using his core is not going to enjoy the fact that you're being forced to have Star Alchemist, Homeowner, and Sword Flash, 2 heroes that you won't get much value from. So finally, how on earth would I build this hero? A lot of people would tell you to use block attack or block HP or any block stone that obviously gives him block. I think that's a terrible idea, because if you look at his abilities, his basic attack gives 35% block to all allies, so everybody, including himself. So a block imprint here would go ahead and give him 70% block, which when combined with that 35% already takes him to 105% block. That's way more than enough. You wouldn't even need to consider using a block stone. Also, 70% block from that imprint combines brilliantly with already passive block boosts he's going to gain. If you go to the guild, you could have a look in the warrior guild tech and see warriors gain 15% block. That takes us to 85%. Now, if you take a look at Lord of Fear Aspen's weapon, which is the same class as Aylamak, you'll gain 10% block for giving it to a warrior. So Aylamak gets 10% block here too. That takes him to 95% block with a block imprint, and that's before he's done his basic. So when you combine that with the basic attack, you're taking him well over to 130% block, so he is more than fine. If you add to that star spawns or even treasure trade items, you can reduce the need for that imprint even more, and it gets to a point where there's just no no reason to run even a block stone on him. So I think the best possible stones for him are going to be if he's just here to sit around, attack HP, because let's face it, if you're using him in slower game modes, there's no point making him quick. Although you could also argue maybe there is a reason to give him a speed stone. Maybe you do want to be fast and get that block off before the rest of your heroes do. Maybe because it's a basic attack, you want to make him as fast as possible so he can hit off, block, boost your entire team so that everyone else's block is increased, and that of course increases their chance to block and protect them. So there could be an argument there to run him with speed. Of course, if you're building him for a ton of burst damage, so let's say you did want to try him in Star Expedition and you wanted to go for as much damage as possible, it's arguable that you could be running him with crit attack to try and get all these different forms of his damage to crit the opponent. That could be quite useful. However, there are arguments that that might be redundant given that there are so many different ways that he can gain additional attacks, additional forms of damage that won't necessarily crit because they're counterattacks typically. So it could be better to run him with attack or attack skill damage. Some might even suggest skill damage, holy damage, if you've got him as a high enough homeowner, because that attack bonus he gets won't really play as much as those two skills would. So they're all things to consider and think about as we move forwards and see whether Hyperspace Hunter Aylamak is going to be a reliable hero or not. All in all, though, really, you just need to know he is a hero that's very versatile. As we said, you can build him early, you can build him in the mid-game if you've got his core to support your already bursty and successful Lord of Fear Aspen burst team. You could then also consider building him later on when you've got a second home. And it's nice to see alternatives to running him on your lineup than just chasing a Fairy Queen Vesa. Fairy Queen Vesa is by far the most common secondary homeowner. She works great with Vulcan, with Mockman, with Asmodel. Any major damage dealer hero just appreciates having a Vesa there. The fact that he can come in and take the spot of Vesa by becoming that secondary homeowner, but also replace Star Alchemist Holmes Young by having such a disruptive core, potentially gives you room for more heroes on your team because he's filling the role of two heroes. And some would even argue that you could run Vesa as well, so that you can then refill your shields on top of the shields that you would have gained from Aylamak, and that way you can build the Vesa to be slow so that once the opponent's punched away all of Aylamak's shields, she comes back and gives you more. Whether that's actually the best way to go, we'll have to wait and see, but I'm really excited to see an alternative secondary homeowner that isn't Fairy Queen Vesa for main meta strategies, and an alternative early hero that isn't Fairy Queen Vesa for main meta strategies, and someone that actually takes the place of Star Alchemist Holmes Young is definitely welcome. So all in all, Hyperspace Hunter Aylamak is a hero who absolutely was needed for this game by filling the roles of other heroes we already have, arguably more consistently, by covering so many bases that you can run him in place of multiple heroes, and of course, finally, being someone that's just refreshing, interesting, and new. So if you want to give him a try, do go ahead and feel free to. He's not going to be a bad investment. That core looks fantastic, and let me know how it goes in the comment section. There is one thing though, he is a little bit bugged with his animations still. Hopefully DH Games patch that, so by the time that you guys are watching this, maybe in a few weeks time, DH Games will already fix that, and we'll see some incredible performances from him, and maybe even Star Expedition will prove to be useful for him too, but that remains to be seen, and many are skeptical as to whether he can beat Vesa. I'm not really going to cast my opinion, but I think it may force some people to have to make a really hard choice as to whether they want to focus on Hyperspace Hunter Aylamak on their account, or they want to focus on Fairy Queen Vesa, because they do have drastically different tenants. And that is where things get a little bit messy. So thank you so much for tuning in, guys. If you want to catch more stuff like this, hit that subscribe button. And of course, I'll see you next time. Until then, though, happy idling.